Welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight, we walk along the edge of a river where the air smells like wet clay and crushed reeds, and moonlight turns the water into a slow, dark mirror. You keep your steps quiet, as if the past is asleep and you don't want to bump the furniture. Out here, you hear frogs, wind in the grasses, and distant cooking fires breathing soft smoke into the night. Some parts of tonight are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what-if imagination, because the evidence suggests a lot. Yet historians debate the gaps, so we'll lean on might, may, and could when the ground gets soft. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, tell me your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little nighttime walk travels. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on a river plain so flat it makes the sky feel oversized, like someone ordered extra horizon by mistake. The river is not scenery. It's a force with moods. When it behaves, it leaves rich silt and the promise of harvest. When it doesn't, it rearranges plans with the casual confidence of a cat knocking a cup off a table. You breathe in damp earth cooling after sundown and the faint sweetness of grain. Most historians agree that early city life in southern Mesopotamia develops along the Tigris and Euphrates, and that by the late 4th millennium BCE, large settlements like Uruk grow into complex urban centers. Archaeology suggests dense neighborhoods built in mud brick and a landscape shaped by canals and levees. The evidence we do have points to irrigation as a practical backbone. Fields here are engineered, and engineering demands cooperation. You follow a canal path in your imagination. Mud accepts your feet, then releases them slowly. A dog watches you with a timeless expression of, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." And you decide dogs must have mastered that look before humans mastered record-keeping. Nearby, baskets thump, jars clink, and voices argue over rations in a tone that feels oddly familiar. Joke number 1. Whispered gently. The first big urban drama might be. Who moved my barley? Most historians agree that temples matter here, not only as places of worship but as major institutions. Archaeology suggests they can store surplus and distribute rations, and sometimes coordinate work. A more cautious explanation could be that religion and administrations overlap so much that separating them is like trying to separate flour from bread after it's baked. And here, your question tightens into focus. Memory made physical. What's broadly accepted is that one of the earliest known writing systems develops in this region, and archaeology suggests its earliest uses are practical, often tied to accounting. Goods, rations, land, labor, deliveries. Many scholars propose that writing begins as administration before it becomes literature. Joke number 2. Civilization invents writing, and the first use case is basically spreadsheets. You drift toward a doorway where the light is good. Someone sits there, not a king, not a hero, just a person with steady hands. They hold a flat piece of damp clay and a cut reed shaped into a stylus. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. The marks look like little wedges and lines. At first, many signs likely stand for things and quantities more than for spoken language. But the direction is clear. The world is being pinned down so it won't float away. One interpretation is that the deeper invention isn't only the marks, but the habit of external memory. A careful reading might suggest that once information sits outside your head, attention changes. You start noticing the world as countable and comparable. How much? How many? From where? For whom? That's a possibility. Not a certainty. But it's suggestive. Spoken agreements can blur. Clay waits. Historians still argue whether writing emerges mainly from temple bureaucracy, from broader economic administration, from competition among elites, or from a blend of pressures that converge as cities expand. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself is part of the honest story. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the thinness matters, because everyday voices are harder to catch than rationalists. So you hold the title question softly. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On solid ground. The evidence we do have points to practical knowledge that supports urban life. Water management, storage, measurement, coordinated labor. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, maybe the forgotten thing is not a secret fact, but a way of paying attention. In a river landscape, attention is survival. You read water levels, canal edges, grain stores, and promises. You wander through narrow lanes where mud brick walls release the day's warmth slowly. You smell bread and beer and dust. Kids roll scraps of clay like toys, and the future looks ordinary from the inside. Archaeology suggests increasing specialization in these cities, and the evidence we do have points to long-distance exchange because southern Mesopotamia lacks some raw materials like stone and timber. Goods move, and ideas may move with them, but not everything is written down. This is where the mist arrives, clearly labeled. A popular rumor claims the Sumerians possessed advanced star knowledge from mysterious sources, sometimes woven into modern fringe storytelling about the Anunnaki or a hidden celestial visitor. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it stays popular because it feels like a satisfying tale. Ancient wisdom, lost and waiting. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic language gets mistaken for technical description, and modern imagination fills the gaps. Joke number 3. Very softly. If a cosmic instruction manual existed, it would come with missing pages and tiny fine print. You return to the riverbank in your mind, because the river is your steady motif tonight. Reeds whisper. Water slides past. You imagine the reed stylus again, the quiet tap into clay, and the simple choice to make a memory you can hold. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we'll keep walking with that soft scratch of reed on clay, deeper into the long night. You keep moving without any new fanfare, because the river doesn't stop to announce itself each mile. The night air stays cool against your cheeks, and that faint smell of wet clay follows you like a quiet companion, somewhere nearby. A kiln exhales warmth, and the sound of it is a low, steady sigh, like the earth practicing sleep breathing. Archaeology suggests that what survives from early Mesopotamia is often what can endure fire, burial, and time, baked clay, stone, and the occasional stubborn bit of metal. And that means the Sumerians, without meaning to, become one of history's loudest whisperers. Most historians agree that thousands upon thousands of clay tablets have been recovered from Mesopotamian sites, spanning long periods and many city-states. The evidence we do have points to a world that wrote constantly about sheep, beer, barley, land boundaries, wages, loans, marriages, lawsuits, temple offerings, hymns, and stories. You picture a room where tablets sit in stacks like sleepy bricks. Some are small enough to fit in your palm. Some are bigger, thick like a hand-sized loaf. A few sit inside clay envelopes, yes, envelopes sealed and stamped. because humans apparently invented "do not open until you sign here" as early as they could. You run your fingers over the idea of those seal impressions, tiny scenes rolled into wet clay, repeating the same images again and again like a logo. It's oddly modern. Your brain wants to say branding, but you keep it bedtime soft. One interpretation is that the tablets aren't just records. They're a training device for a whole culture. A careful reading might suggest that when a society writes its transactions, it starts living slightly differently. You don't only trade, you document the trade. You don't only promise, you inscribe the promise. This might support the idea that trust becomes something you can store, like grain, in a storeroom of clay. Historians still argue whether the earliest writing was mainly about efficiency or about authority, whether the marks are primarily a tool to reduce confusion, or a tool to control resources, or both at once. There's no full consensus because a tablet can be two things at the same time. A helpful note for tomorrow and a lever of power for next year. You walk past the doorway of a temple storehouse. You hear the soft clack of jars, the shuffle of sandals, the quiet cough of someone counting under their breath. The counting itself feels like a ritual, not mystical exactly, but steady, deliberate, and oddly soothing. Archaeology suggests that many tablets relate to ration distributions, standardized portions of grain or beer for workers. The evidence we do have points to organized labor, to schedules, to lists of names. If you lean close enough, you can almost hear a manager's tired voice saying, "No, you cannot have extra beer rations because you felt spiritual today." That's your first light joke of this section, slipping in like a small smile rather than a laugh. You pause at a low table where a scribe sits. The lamp beside them is a shallow dish of oil with a wick, and the flame's movement makes the shadows on the wall look like they're breathing. The scribe presses the stylus, lifts it, turns the tablet, presses again. Their hands don't hurry. Their hands know the rhythm. It's like watching someone knit, if knitting could accidentally invent civilization. Most historians agree that cuneiform develops over time from earlier pictographic marks into a system that can represent language more fully, including syllables. Archaeology suggests the signs evolve and multiply, then standardize, then shift again as different languages use the same script. The evidence we do have points to a living technology, changing as cities change. Writing isn't born complete. It grows like a plant, slow, branching, shaped by the light it's given. And now, gently, the misted question returns. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, they knew how to make memory portable. A clay tablet can outlast a human voice by millennia. It can outlast a dynasty. It can outlast a city wall. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, maybe what they knew was that the future is fragile and that fragile things need containers. One interpretation is that the act of writing turns time into a place you can visit. A careful reading might suggest that a scribe is building a doorway. You press a mark today, and someone you'll never meet can stand in it later. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's hard not to feel it in your bones when you imagine a tablet being unearthed after thousands of years. It's like a message in a bottle, except the bottle is mud and the ocean is time. Historians still argue whether the earliest scribes thought of themselves as doing something grand, or whether they simply saw it as work, like hauling water or shaping bricks. The evidence we do have points to both: the practical tone of many records and the eventual prestige of scribal skill. There's no full consensus on when society collectively realizes, "Oh, this changes everything." You step sideways into another kind of tablet world, the ones that are not accounting at all. Some tablets preserve hymns and prayers. Some preserve proverbs. Some hold stories that feel like they were meant to be spoken aloud. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian literature, written in cuneiform, includes epics and myths that circulate for centuries. Archaeology suggests these texts are copied and recopied, sometimes with small variations, like a song with different verses, depending on the singer. One interpretation is that copying itself is a kind of cultural breathing. Inhale the old words, exhale them again, keep them alive. A more cautious explanation could be that copying is also a filter. Each recopy can shift emphasis, tidy contradictions, or reshape a story to fit a new audience. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Here's where you add the required gentle disclaimer. Again, like a soft handrail. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now you let yourself drift into a cinematic what-if mood note. Carefully labeled. What if the tablets were not only notes and stories, but also a mirror for the mind? What if by externalizing memory? Sumerian society learned an early version of something we struggle with today. How to keep knowledge from dissolving in noise. This isn't a hidden truth. It's a puzzle, an open question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You pick up an imagined tablet, just for a moment, and feel its weight. It's heavier than you expect, which is funny because a modern person is used to information being weightless. Joke number 2. The ancient cloud storage is literally a lump of mud, and it will absolutely not sink unless you fire it in a kiln. You set it down again and listen. Outside the tablet room, the city breathes. People speak, argue, laugh, footsteps scuff. Somewhere a donkey complains about its job description, and you silently agree with it. The river is still there, always there, and it has that slow sound like a giant turning in its sleep. A fringe idea proposes that some Sumerian texts encode advanced scientific data in symbolic form, astronomy, geometry, hidden maps of the sky, left for later ages to decode. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because it's romantic. Knowledge hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that symbolism sometimes overlaps with observation. But a more cautious explanation could be that people use the sky as a metaphor because the sky is always above you, always present, always emotionally available for storytelling. Historians still argue whether the line between observation and omen in Mesopotamia is a sharp line or a blended one. The evidence we do have points to careful watching of natural patterns, but also to interpretive frameworks that don't match modern science. There's no full consensus on how individuals in different roles, priests, farmers, scribes, balanced those modes. You return to the calmest solid ground. The tablet as a time capsule. Archaeology suggests that many tablets survive because cities burn or collapse, and fires accidentally bake the clay hard. The evidence we do have points to a strange irony. Disaster sometimes preserves memory. That's not gore, not fear-mongering, just one of history's quiet contradictions. You keep walking, and you keep the small motif with you. The smell of damp clay, the tap of reed on tablet, the sense of memory made tangible. You don't need a single hidden truth to feel wonder. You only need to notice how a simple mark, pressed into mud by a tired hand, can outlast empires. You drift onward with that same soft rhythm in your ears. Tap, press, lift, the little sound of clay accepting a mark. The air stays cool, and the city's heat releases slowly from mud brick walls like a long exhale. Somewhere in the distance, a flute tries a melody and decides to keep it simple. which is honestly a relatable creative choice at midnight. Most historians agree that scribal education becomes a formal thing in Mesopotamia, especially as writing grows more complex and more central to institutions. Archaeology suggests that schools for scribes existed, often identified through clusters of student tablets, practice pieces filled with repeated signs, copied word lists, and sometimes mistakes that feel painfully human. The evidence we do have points to learning by repetition, by copying, by building a hand memory as much as a mind memory. You step into a quiet courtyard where a small group sits in a half circle. The ground is packed earth, the walls are mud brick, and the light is angled just right so the signs on clay are visible. A teacher, calm but not endlessly patient, holds a tablet and demonstrates strokes. The students stare at their own tablets with the intensity of people who know they will be judged by tiny wedges. Joke number 1 slides in gently. If you've ever squinted at your own handwriting and thought, "This looks like a scared spider," congratulations. You and an ancient student scribe share a spiritual bond. What's broadly accepted is that scribal training included lists of signs, lists of words, lists of professions, lists of cities, lists of animals. Some of these lists appear again and again across time, suggesting a standard curriculum. One interpretation is that these lists are more than study tools. They're a way of organizing the world. A careful reading might suggest that if you train a child to categorize reality, this is a bird, this is a tool, this is a city, this is a god, you're teaching them a mental grid they may carry for life. Historians still argue whether scribal schools primarily served temple and palace bureaucracy, or whether they also supported private commerce and family advancement in broader ways. There's no full consensus, because education can be both, a pipeline for institutions and a ladder for individuals. The evidence we do have points to scribes holding a special place in society, but also to variation, different levels, different roles, different access. You watch a student copy a line, then copy it again, then again. Their reed stylus makes the same sound each time, and the repetition is almost hypnotic. You notice the teacher's eyes, not cruel, but sharp. In this world, accuracy matters. A miswritten sign could change a number, a name, a contract. And in a city that runs on rations and records, a changed number is not just a mistake. It's a ripple. One interpretation is that scribal culture trains attention the way a musician trains timing. The student learns to slow down, to check, to compare, to hold a pattern in the mind while the hand performs it. A more cautious explanation could be that repetition is simply the best method available for mastering complex signs. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the effect might be similar either way. A mind shaped by carefulness. Most historians agree that the script we call cuneiform becomes adaptable and is used to write multiple languages over long periods, including Sumerian and Akkadian. Archaeology suggests scribes are often bilingual or trained to handle different linguistic contexts, depending on place and period. The evidence we do have points to scribes as cultural carriers. They keep old forms alive even as spoken language shifts. That's a mainstream safe observation, and it leads to a gentle what if without crossing into fantasy. What if the forgotten thing isn't a lost machine or secret map, but a lost patience, a lost ability to be slow and exact, to build knowledge through repeated practice rather than constant novelty? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, scribal schooling might hint at a kind of mental stamina we've made rarer in ourselves. Not because we're worse, but because we live in a different environment. You can almost feel the student's wrist ache, and you realize that learning history sometimes means imagining the body, not just the mind. The clay is cool, slightly damp, and it leaves residue on fingers. Dust sticks to sweat. The teacher's voice is steady, and it has that tone adults use when they're trying not to sound tired in front of children, which is adorable and universal. Joke number 2. Softly. The first homework assignment in civilization might have been, copy this list of signs 200 times, and the first student complaint might have been, but why do we need this? It's not like I'm going to use it in real life. Spoiler. They used it in real life. Archaeology suggests that some student tablets include lines that look like discipline exercises, and some later texts include reflections on the hardships of school. The evidence we do have points to something comforting. The past includes eye rolls. Even in a world of gods and kings, a kid can still be a kid. Historians still argue whether our modern picture of the scribal school is too neat, whether there were many informal teaching setups alongside formal institutions. There's no full consensus, because the archaeological record preserves moments, not entire educational systems. A careful reading might suggest that learning could happen in households, workshops, temples, palaces, and anywhere a skilled scribe had apprentices. That's interpretation, not certainty. Now you let a small, mystery-tinted thread enter, clearly labeled. A popular rumor claims that ancient schools taught hidden wisdom beyond writing, secret astronomy, coded theology, or instructions for rituals meant to manipulate reality. This is the kind of rumor that thrives in modern storytelling because it's exciting. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it echoes a real, documented truth. Knowledge in many societies is layered. Some knowledge is for everyone. Some is for specialists. Some is for those with access. That doesn't require a supernatural conclusion. It only requires social structure. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that certain texts were restricted or specialized, but a more cautious explanation could be that secret knowledge simply means hard knowledge that takes years to learn. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You watch a teacher hand a student a more advanced tablet. The student's eyes widen. The signs are denser now, arranged in neat lines. The student sits up straighter. A careful reading might suggest that in that moment, education becomes identity. You aren't just learning marks. You're becoming someone who can hold the city's memory. Most historians agree that scribes play roles beyond accounting. They draft contracts, keep archives, write letters, preserve hymns and stories. Archaeology suggests archives existed, rooms or jars where tablets were stored, sometimes organized. The evidence we do have points to a world where paper doesn't exist yet, but paperwork absolutely does, spiritually speaking. Joke number 3. If you think your modern bureaucracy is intense, remember that some poor ancient clerk had to count sheep without a calculator and then carve the answer into mud. Respect. Now, gently, you return to the truth ladder tone that must thread through every section. Some parts are documented, student tablets, repeated lists, the existence of scribal roles. Some parts are interpretation, how education shaped thinking, how identity formed around literacy. And some is gentle imagination, the look of lamplight on a courtyard wall, the sound of a teacher's sigh, the feeling in a student's wrist. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the emotional texture is thin because emotions don't fossilize well. Historians still argue whether literacy in early periods was tightly restricted or more widespread than once assumed. There's no full consensus, and estimates vary depending on region, period, and what counts as literacy. A careful reading might suggest that, even if only a minority wrote, many more interacted with writing through seals, spoken contracts, public inscriptions, and everyday administration as you leave the courtyard. You keep your small motif in your pocket, the reed stylus, the cool clay, the patient repetition. The city's sounds soften behind you. The river is still nearby, quietly moving, as if it's reading its own long, flowing text across the land. And you carry a calm what if, like a pebble. What if what we forgot was not a secret, but a practice? How to let knowledge take time. How to build it wedge by wedge. How to trust slow learning. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And tonight, you're not proving anything. You're simply walking through the clues at a sleepy pace, letting them settle. You keep walking with that soft scratch of reed on clay still echoing in your mind, like a metronome for the past. The river smell fades and returns in gentle waves. Mud, reeds, a hint of smoke, depending on how the night breeze leans. Somewhere a door creaks, and you decide that even in ancient cities, doors had a flair for dramatic timing. Most historians agree that the Sumerians and their neighbors cared deeply about naming and ordering the past. Archaeology suggests that lists, especially king lists, were copied and preserved across centuries. And the evidence we do have points to a desire for continuity, a line of rulers, a sequence of cities, a structure laid over messy time. If you've ever tried to organize your photos into albums and ended up with a folder called Sort Later, you already understand the ancient struggle. You step into a temple-adjacent room where a scribe unrolls, not paper, but memory. They set a tablet down, and another beside it, and another. A careful reading might suggest that the purpose of these lists isn't only to remember, it's to shape what remembering means. Names are chosen, reigns are counted, cities are elevated. The past becomes a curated hallway with certain portraits hung at eye level. What's broadly accepted is that the Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies and versions, and that it mixes rulers we can connect to historical contexts with reign lengths that are obviously not literal in a modern sense, especially the extremely long reigns attributed to early antediluvian kings. One interpretation is that those long reigns are symbolic, a way to express deep time or legitimacy rather than a factual calendar. A more cautious explanation could be that the list blends older traditions, mythic material, and political ideology into a single narrative of order. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the king list was primarily a political tool to legitimize certain dynasties, a scribal exercise in organizing tradition, or a broader cultural attempt to frame history as a divinely guided sequence. There's no full consensus, and the debate matters because it keeps us honest about what a list is. It can record, but it can also persuade. You imagine the list being recited aloud. The sound is steady, almost like prayer. After kingship descended from heaven. The phrase itself is a clue, because it shows you how the past is being framed. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian societies often linked authority to the divine. And the evidence we do have points to kingship as not merely political, but cosmological, an office that sits between humans and gods in the story world. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Descended from heaven doesn't have to mean a literal object falling from the sky. A careful reading might suggest it's a way of saying that authority is sacred, that it has a source beyond ordinary human negotiation. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's a mainstream safe way to keep meaning and fact in their proper lanes. Joke number 1. Quiet and friendly. When you say your job came from above, your boss usually means upper management in ancient Mesopotamia. Upper management is a bit higher. You walk along the wall where the city's seals are stored. Cylindrical seals, each with its own tiny carved scene. Many show figures in procession, deities animals, offering scenes, images that compress identity into a small roll of stone. Archaeology suggests seals functioned as signatures and security devices, and the evidence we do have points to an administrative world where authenticity matters. A seal says, "This came from me," or from my household, or from my office. It's a name you can press into clay. One interpretation is that seals and lists belong to the same, deeper habit, making identity stable across time. When your world is built of mud brick and floodwater can remake the landscape, stability becomes precious. A more cautious explanation could be that seals and lists simply arise as practical solutions to the needs of complex societies. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But the emotional resonance is hard to ignore. Now the mystery-leaning part arrives, carefully labeled and kept at 30%. A fringe idea proposes that the exaggerated reign lengths in early king lists preserve a coded memory of something else, astronomical cycles, lost calendars, or even a distorted record of a different kind of timekeeping. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's one of those ideas that keeps returning because the numbers look strange to modern eyes, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. We can say the numbers are real on the tablet, but their meaning is not fully settled. Historians still argue whether those long reigns reflect symbolic numerology, scribal convention, theological messaging, or layered traditions whose original context is hard to recover. There's no full consensus, and the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You step outside again, back into the alleyways where daily life continues. A woman carries a jar on her hip with the ease of someone who's done it 1,000 times. A man argues with a donkey as if the donkey will suddenly agree, which is charming optimism. The city smells like bread, sweat, and river dampness. And you realize something. The curated past is always nearby, but it doesn't replace the present. It sits alongside it, like a formal portrait hanging above a kitchen table. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states had shifting power dynamics, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and others, rising and falling across time. Archaeology suggests competing centers of authority, alliances, wars, and reforms, though details vary by period and source type. The evidence we do have points to a landscape of rivalry and cooperation, never as tidy as a list wants it to be. Joke number 2, softly. If the king list were a modern social media feed, it would definitely be curated for maximum prestige and minimal awkward family drama. You pause at the edge of a courtyard where someone is telling a story. People lean in. The storyteller's voice is low, and their hands move like they're shaping the air. A careful reading might suggest that oral tradition and written tradition are partners, not enemies. Writing doesn't erase speech. It anchors it. Sometimes. And sometimes speech ignores writing and goes its own way, which is also very human. Historians still argue whether the written lists reflect popular memory or elite ideology more strongly. There's no full consensus. And your calm approach tonight is to hold both possibilities gently. The evidence we do have points to elite scribal environments producing many texts. But that doesn't mean ordinary people had no relationship to the stories. They lived under kings, paid rations, visited temples, heard tales, saw seals pressed into clay. Even if they couldn't read, writing still shaped the world around them. Now you return to the guiding question in a sleep-friendly way. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, they knew that memory can be constructed. They knew that a list can turn chaos into sequence. They knew that names, when preserved, can outlive walls. One interpretation is that they understood, perhaps intuitively, that whoever organizes the past influences the future. That's not a conspiracy. It's a normal human effect. And in the cinematic mist, you imagine a hallway of tablets, each one a door. Some doors open easily. Rations, inventories, visible institutions. Some doors stick. Symbolic reigns, mythic phrases, numbers whose intention is debated. You don't have to force them. You can simply rest your hand on the clay and feel its cool certainty. Joke number 3. Barely a whisper, the past is like a jar sealed with clay. If you pry too hard, you break it, and then you have to pretend you meant to do that all along. You step away, still carrying the sound of the reed stylus, still smelling the river mud. The city behind you continues its soft, nocturnal life. The curated list of kings hangs in the air like a chant, but the real world hums underneath it, busy, imperfect, alive. And you keep walking, letting the solid ground stay solid, letting the mist stay mist, and letting the clues arrange themselves slowly as you go. You move on as if the city is guiding you by the hand, gently, without sudden turns. The night feels smoother now, like the air has learned your pace. The reed stylus sound stays with you, but softer, more like a memory of a sound than the sound itself. The river is nearby, not always visible, but always present in the smell, damp soil, green reed, and the faint mineral note of silt. Most historians agree that temples in Sumerian city-states are central institutions, and archaeology suggests they function as more than sacred spaces. The evidence we do have points to temples as economic hubs, storing grain, managing herds, distributing rations, organizing labor, and anchoring festivals. It's broadly accepted that religion and administration overlap, sometimes so completely that it's hard to draw a clean line between spiritual and practical. You walk toward a temple precinct where a raised platform lifts the building above the plain, like a ship on a sea of mud brick. The lamps are warmer here. You smell oil, incense, and something sweet. Maybe dates, maybe honey, maybe just the human urge to make the air feel special. You hear the low murmur of people speaking with careful respect, and you realize that the temple isn't only a place, it's a mood. A careful reading might suggest that a temple is also a calendar. It tells you when to gather, when to harvest, when to give thanks, when to mourn, when to hope. One interpretation is that ritual is a social technology. It coordinates a community's attention. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual emerges naturally in any complex society because people need shared meaning, especially when life is uncertain. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But either way, the effect is real in the texture of the city. You pass a storeroom door and catch a glimpse of sealed jars, stacks of baskets, and tablets tucked into corners like quiet supervisors. Archaeology suggests ration lists and temple accounts are common, and the evidence we do have points to careful systems of tracking offerings and distributions. The idea feels mundane until you sit with it for a moment. In a world where drought and flood can swing the year, a storeroom is not just storage, it's survival. Joke number 1. Softly, the ancient temple is part cathedral, part warehouse, and part accounting department. So, yes, even the gods probably had to wait for paperwork. You find yourself near a table where offerings are being recorded. Someone brings grain, someone brings wool, someone brings a small animal, someone brings a jar of beer that looks suspiciously like it was accidentally made extra large. A scribe presses marks into clay with practiced calm. The reed stylus doesn't care if the offering is sacred. It cares if the number is right. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion includes a pantheon of deities tied to cities and natural forces, and archaeology suggests temples were dedicated to major gods and goddesses, whose names appear in texts and inscriptions. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where divine favor matters, and where humans negotiate that favor through offerings, hymns, and ritual obligations. Now you pause at the edge of an inner courtyard. The sound changes here. It's quieter, but not empty. It's like the quiet you get when many people are being quiet together. You smell incense and hot clay. The wall is cool under your fingertips. You notice a small symbol painted near a doorway, and it reminds you that even in ancient cities, people liked signs, literal signs, to tell you where you are and what you're supposed to do. One interpretation is that temples are places where the city's memory is concentrated. Not only the tablets, but the stories, the city's origin myths, its sacred festivals, its sense of who we are. A careful reading might suggest that when the temple says, "This is what happened," that story becomes part of civic identity. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's consistent with how institutions work in many times and places. Historians still argue whether temple economies were the dominant engine of early cities, or whether private households and independent merchants played equally large roles depending on period and region. There's no full consensus, and it matters because it changes the picture. Is the city mostly run through temple channels, or is it a more mixed ecosystem? The evidence we do have points to variety, different cities, different eras, different balances. You drift into the administrative side of the temple precinct, where the sacred and the bureaucratic share a wall. You see a row of workers receiving rations, grain, beer, maybe oil, and you notice the calm order of it. People wait, not because they love waiting, but because systems require lines. A scribe records names, another checks quantities. A supervisor watches with the tired patience of someone who has seen every trick in the book. Joke number 2. The first person to say, "My name isn't on the list, but I'm basically on the list," probably lived here. The mainstream ground is steady. The evidence we do have points to organized distributions and record keeping. But then the mist arrives, gently, as it should. What if those records are doing more than counting? What if they also encode a way of thinking, one that later cultures inherit unevenly? A fringe idea proposes that temple archives included lost manuals of advanced knowledge, engineering principles, astronomical algorithms, or secret rituals that functioned like technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because temples feel like the kind of place where important knowledge would be stored. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say temples did store knowledge, and some knowledge may have been specialized, but whether it was advanced in the way modern rumor suggests is an open question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that certain texts were restricted to trained specialists, but a more cautious explanation could be that the secret was simply expertise, long apprenticeships, careful observation, and the slow accumulation of practical wisdom. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian ritual texts should be read primarily as religious performance, as psychological comfort, as social control, or as a blend of all three. There's no full consensus, and your sleepy approach tonight is to accept the blend without forcing a single answer. You step back toward the temple steps, and you look out over the city. Roof lines stretch into the dark. A canal catches moonlight like a thin blade of silver. Somewhere, a night watchman calls softly, and a dog answers, because dogs apparently consider themselves part of public safety. Most historians agree that Sumerians developed sophisticated irrigation and canal systems, and archaeology suggests continuous maintenance was necessary to keep fields productive in a salty, flood-prone environment. The evidence we do have points to a society that understood the cost of neglect. If you don't clear the canal, the water won't move right. If the water doesn't move right, nothing else does. One interpretation is that this is the forgotten knowledge in miniature. Not a hidden secret, but the understanding that civilization is maintenance. A careful reading might suggest that rituals, records, and offerings are all forms of maintenance too. Maintenance of order, of trust, of meaning. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it sits neatly beside the practical facts. Joke number 3. Whispered. The ancient world may not have invented the internet, but it did invent the idea that if you stop paying attention for 1 week, everything breaks. You let the temple fade behind you as you continue through the night. The incense smell lingers on your clothes and your imagination, and the clay dust lingers on your fingertips. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented. Temple archives, ration systems, named deities, institutional roles. Some parts are interpretation, how ritual trains attention, how records shape thought. And some parts are gentle imagination, the lamplight in the courtyard, the quiet line of workers, the sense of the city breathing around its sacred center. You keep walking, and the river keeps moving, and the reed stylus sound stays with you like a lullaby of order. Tap, press, lift. You don't stop. You just let the city's rhythm carry you forward, like drifting on a slow boat where the oar barely touches the water. The air is cooler now, and the smell of incense from the temple precinct thins out, replaced again by damp earth and the faint metallic scent of river silt. Somewhere a jar lid clinks, and you feel oddly reassured, because as long as somebody is still putting lids on jars, the world hasn't completely unraveled. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cultures developed sophisticated systems of measurement, and that the sexagesimal, or base 60, approach becomes a lasting legacy in how time and angles are later handled. Most historians agree that the roots of these systems reach deep into ancient Mesopotamia, even if details shift over centuries and across languages. Archaeology suggests administrative tablets often include numerical notations for quantities, grain, livestock, labor, and the evidence we do have points to people who are not just counting, but standardizing. You stand near a stall where a merchant measures grain into a container with practiced motion. A worker nearby weighs wool. Another checks a length of cloth against a measuring rope. Nobody is doing math for fun. They're doing it because food must be divided, taxes must be paid, wages must be recorded, and agreements must survive tomorrow's arguments. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the city's heartbeat in the clink of measures and the murmur of numbers. One interpretation is that measurement is the quiet skeleton of city life. A careful reading might suggest that once you can measure reliably, you can plan. Once you can plan, you can coordinate. Once you can coordinate, you can build projects bigger than any one household. Canals, walls, temples, fleets of boats. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a reasonable way to connect the dots. Historians still argue whether base 60 became dominant because it's mathematically convenient, because it fit earlier counting practices, because it aligned with trade needs, or because it was reinforced by scribal schooling and bureaucratic habit. There's no full consensus, and it's comforting in a bedtime way to know that even math has a biography, an origin story full of human choices. You drift toward a scribe's corner where a tablet sits on a low stand. The marks are neat, the columns carefully spaced. It looks like a modern spreadsheet, except instead of a glowing screen, it's a slab of fired earth that could outlive your entire family tree. You imagine the scribe's mind, numbers not as abstract clouds, but as physical wedges pressed into clay. The number has weight, it has shape, it has consequences. Joke number 1. Gentle. Ancient accountants didn't have calculator anxiety, because their calculator was a reed and their anxiety was just called life. Most historians agree that Sumerians used standardized units for capacity, weight, and length, though the exact relationships can vary over time and place. And later, Mesopotamian systems evolve as well. Archaeology suggests that many of these systems are embedded in administrative texts, and the evidence we do have points to a practical obsession with how much barley, how much beer, how much labor, how much land, how much time. And now, your question slides in again. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot, on documented ground? They knew how to break the world into manageable pieces. They knew how to measure enough to build a stable routine. One interpretation is that they understood something modern people often resist, that abstraction can be soothing. When life is unpredictable, a unit of measure is a small island of certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that measurement simply emerges wherever trade and administration expand. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But the emotional effect still seems plausible. You look up at the sky. The stars are sharp tonight, as if the air has been polished. You notice how easy it is to fall into counting when you look at stars. 1, 2, 3, because the mind wants patterns. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamians watched the sky closely, and the evidence we do have points to long traditions of astronomical observation developing in the region over time. But tonight, you stay early and gentle, focusing on the feeling rather than the technical details. One interpretation is that a base 60 mindset, even if born in commerce, eventually becomes a way to carve time itself. Minutes, seconds, degrees, circles. A careful reading might suggest that by counting in a flexible base with many devices, you can divide and share more easily. That's a practical explanation, and it's mainstream safe. Historians still argue whether the sexagesimal preference began as a deliberate design or as a convergence of older counting methods, like using fingers and knuckles, grouping, and trade conventions that slowly hardened into standard. There's no full consensus. And that uncertainty is oddly cozy. It means the system we still live inside may have started with someone making a practical choice on a busy market day. Joke number 2. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a person probably said, "Let's use 60. It's divisible by a lot." And another person probably replied, "Sure, sounds fine," not realizing they just shaped how you read a clock while half asleep at 2:17 a.m. You wander past a workshop where a builder checks angles with a simple tool, maybe a plumb line, maybe a right-angle guide, maybe just a practiced eye. Archaeology suggests construction required planning and standardization, and the evidence we do have points to skilled craftspeople who could translate measurements into walls, canals, and platforms. A careful reading might suggest that this is where abstraction becomes physical. Numbers turn into bricks in a line, a wall standing straight, water moving exactly where it should. Now, carefully, you let in the 30% mist, labeled as mist. A fringe idea proposes that base 60 isn't only practical, but inherited from a lost scientific tradition, sometimes tied in modern rumor to star knowledge, secret priestly formulas, or even outside influence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it feels like a code. If we can just decode the numbers, we'll find the hidden message. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say, the system is clever, and clever things invite storytelling. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that priestly specialists used numbers in ways ordinary people didn't fully understand. But a more cautious explanation could be that specialized math arises naturally wherever administration and astronomy grow complex. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the earliest uses of these number systems should be viewed as proto-science in a modern sense, or as practical administration that later becomes useful for science. There's no full consensus, and the words themselves, science, math, religion, are modern boxes that don't always fit ancient reality neatly. That's part of the puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You notice your own breathing. It's slower now. You let the idea of measurement become soothing rather than dry. You imagine the scribe pressing the wedge marks with calm repetition. You imagine a jar filled to a standardized line. You imagine time divided into neat segments, not to trap you, but to help you share the day fairly. Joke number 3. Very soft. If your modern day feels chaotic, just remember, some ancient person was already trying to schedule the universe, and you're allowed to ignore your calendar occasionally. You step away from the market. The city quiets again. The river murmurs in the dark. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, documented systems of measurement and number notation, interpreted effects on planning and attention, imagined moments of a scribe under starlight wondering if numbers can hold the world steady. And you keep walking, the clock of the night still ticking in base 60, whether anyone asked it to or not. You keep gliding forward, and the city grows quieter in that late-night way where even the dogs seem to lower their voices out of respect for sleep. The river stays close, a dark presence you can't always see but can always sense, like a long ribbon of coolness laid across the land. The air smells faintly of damp clay again, and somewhere a reed patch rustles as if it's whispering secrets to itself. Most historians agree that people in ancient Mesopotamia paid close attention to the sky, and archaeology suggests that careful observation of celestial cycles becomes especially well developed over time in the region. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition in which the movement of stars, planets, and the moon mattered, not only for wonder, but for calendars, agriculture, and planning. And in a world where the river can surprise you and the seasons can drift, a calendar isn't just useful, it's comfort. You step into an open space beyond the tight lanes, where the rooftops fall away and the sky expands. The stars look crisp, and the moonlight makes the canal water shimmer like a thin strip of polished metal. You hear a low voice near a rooftop edge, someone pointing upward, counting softly, calling out the rising of something bright. One interpretation is that the sky becomes a kind of shared screen for early cities. A careful reading might suggest that when you watch the heavens together, you learn to agree about time. You learn when the month begins. You learn when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's a gentle and reasonable bridge between observation and community life. Historians still argue whether early celestial watching in Sumerian contexts was mostly practical calendar keeping, mostly omen-based interpretation, or a blend that shifts depending on who is watching and why. There's no full consensus. And that uncertainty is important because it keeps you from imagining a single, unified Sumerian view of the sky. A farmer might look up and think, "Rain soon." A priest might look up and think, "What does this mean?" A scribe might look up and think, "How do I write this down without smudging the tablet?" You drift closer to the watcher. They hold a simple tool, maybe nothing more than a straight stick, maybe a string, maybe just a practiced gaze. The lamp beside them flickers and threatens to go out, and they shield it with a hand. You notice how human the scene is. The sky is enormous, but the method is small, patient, and personal. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian omen traditions include detailed records and interpretations of celestial events, and archaeology suggests the existence of texts that catalog patterns and associate them with outcomes. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the sky is readable. But tonight, you keep a careful boundary. A careful reading might suggest that reading the sky can mean two things: observation and interpretation. The first is looking, the second is deciding what looking means. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that meticulous sky-watching trained observation skills. But a more cautious explanation could be that omen interpretation reflects cultural frameworks rather than predictive science. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Joke number 1. Softly. The first weather app was probably just a person squinting at the horizon and saying, "The moon looks suspicious tonight." You sit in your imagination on a rooftop edge. The baked mud brick is warm from the day, cooling slowly. You hear distant water being poured into jars, the soft clink of pottery, the muffled laugh of someone who's trying not to wake a sleeping child. The city is alive but dimmed, like a lantern turned low. One interpretation is that the sky offered Sumerians a stable pattern in a world of unstable earth. The river can flood, a canal can silt up, a wall can crumble, but the moon still cycles. Certain stars still return. A careful reading might suggest that this reliability makes the sky feel like a promise. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's emotionally plausible. Historians still argue whether the earliest structured constellations and star catalogues begin in Sumerian contexts or develop more fully in later Mesopotamian traditions, and how much can be traced directly versus inferred from later evidence. There's no full consensus because the record is uneven, and because later texts can preserve older traditions while also reshaping them. The evidence we do have points to continuity, but continuity is not always a straight line. Now, gently, you invite the mist, labeled as mist. A popular rumor claims that Sumerian star knowledge came from teachers who are not fully human, beings described in myth, sometimes reimagined in modern fringe storytelling as advanced visitors. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's a familiar shape in modern imagination. The sky's mysterious, so we put mysterious teachers in it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say mythic language sometimes reflects real reverence for knowledge, and reverence can get reinterpreted as literal biography. To be clear, this is debated. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that priestly specialists held advanced observational knowledge for their time, but a more cautious explanation could be that social authority and symbolic storytelling elevate those specialists into semi-mythic roles. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You listen to the watcher's quiet murmurs. They name things you can't fully catch. They might be naming stars, or months, or gods, or simply directions. You notice the practical side again, the need to know when a month begins, when a festival is due, when the river's seasonal behavior might shift. Most historians agree that calendars are essential to agricultural societies, and archaeology suggests that managing time was a core administrative concern. The evidence we do have points to people who are serious about months and days, because survival depends on timing. Joke number 2. If you think remembering your friend's birthday is hard, imagine running a city festival schedule without a phone, without paper, and with a river that can casually rewrite your plans. You glance down from the rooftop at the canal grid. You see how the water lines cut through the city like veins. You imagine the temple festival lights reflecting in the water. You imagine the scribes marking days, the workers receiving rations, the priests preparing hymns. And you feel, just for a moment, how sky watching could tie it all together. The heavens become the slow clock above the faster clock of human life. Historians still argue whether omen interpretation should be seen as superstition, proto-science, or a coherent knowledge system in its own cultural terms. There's no full consensus, and the safest bedtime truth is that humans are pattern makers. We see patterns because patterns help us survive. Sometimes the patterns are real. Sometimes they're our minds trying to make meaning. Both can be true at different times. Now you return to the title question. Softly. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, they knew the value of long observation. They knew to watch for cycles, to align the community to shared timing. One interpretation is that they understood how attention shapes reality. What you watch carefully becomes your world. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply what complex societies do: build calendars, track seasons, coordinate labor. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Joke number 3, whispered, maybe the real ancient secret is just going outside and looking up once in a while. Revolutionary. I know. You let the sky hold you. The stars don't demand conclusions. They just shine. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented traditions of celestial observation and calendar concern. Interpreted effects on community attention. Imagined rooftop quiet where the universe feels close enough to count. And you keep walking, with the river scent in your nose, the soft tap of reed on clay in your memory. And the sky above you, like an ancient ceiling that never needed rebuilding. You keep moving, and the rooftops slide behind you as you return toward the lower ground where the river breathes heavier. The air cools another degree, and the smells deepen. Mud, algae, wet reeds, like the night is steeping them into a stronger tea. The canal water makes a soft, persistent sound as it nudges the banks, and you notice how that sound can feel peaceful right up until the moment it doesn't. Water is gentle until it's in charge. Archaeology suggests that flooding in southern Mesopotamia was a recurring reality, and the evidence we do have points to communities that built, rebuilt, and adapted around water's unpredictability. Most historians agree that floods left their mark not only in stories, but sometimes in layers of silt found in excavation contexts, though the interpretation of any single flood layer can be complex. What's broadly accepted is that water-shaped settlement choices, agricultural schedules, and the emotional tone of life on this plain. You walk along a low embankment. Your feet sink slightly, then find firmer ground. In the moonlight. The river looks calm, but you can sense the strength beneath it. You imagine a farmer touching the water's surface, feeling its temperature, its speed, and thinking in quiet calculations. Will it behave this year? You hear a distant night bird call, and the sound feels like punctuation. One interpretation is that living with floods trains a culture to think in layers. Today, next season, next generation. A careful reading might suggest that if your world can be wiped and rewritten by water, you become deeply aware of fragility. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it fits the reality archaeology suggests. Cities here were frequently rebuilt, often on top of earlier layers, creating the mounds that later archaeologists dig into. Historians still argue whether specific flood layers at sites like Shuruppak, or Kish should be linked to particular historical events or treated as one of many floods across centuries. There's no full consensus, because rivers flood repeatedly, and a layer of silt can represent different episodes depending on context. The evidence we do have points to big water events, But connecting them directly to a single story is not always straightforward. You pause and imagine a trench wall, layers of habitation, then a band of cleaner silt, then habitation again. It looks like a scar in the city's body. Above it, broken pots, ash, reed impressions, crumbs of everyday life. Then the water layer, oddly uniform. Then life returns, messy again, because humans can't help being messy. Joke number 1. Softly. The river is basically the world's harshest editor, and it loves deleting drafts. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood stories, especially the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh and related traditions, are among the most famous narratives to come from the region. Archaeology suggests that these stories circulated in written form in later periods, and the evidence we do have points to a deep cultural memory of destructive water. But here, your truth ladder stays steady. The story exists. Floods happened. Linking any one flood event directly to the myth is debated. One interpretation is that flood myths compress many floods into one great symbolic flood. A careful reading might suggest that the story is less about a single meteorological event and more about a world view. The sense that civilization is always one season away from being reset. That's interpretation, not certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that the narrative draws on real regional experiences of flooding and reshapes them into a moral and theological frame. Historians still argue whether the flood story's details reflect specific local memories, wider cultural borrowing, or a mixture of both. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is a feature. Not a flaw, it's the honest edge of what we can say. You keep walking, and the river sound grows louder for a moment as you pass a narrow bend. You imagine workers reinforcing a levee with baskets of earth. You imagine someone checking a canal gate. You imagine families moving valuables to higher shelves. Just in case. Archaeology suggests irrigation and flood control required constant maintenance. And the evidence we do have points to communities who knew that water management was never done. It was a daily relationship. Joke number 2. If you ever feel tired of doing the same chores over and over, remember, ancient people also had maintenance fatigue. Except their chore list included, keep the river from eating the city. Now, gently, you invite the 30% missed. A fringe idea proposes that the flood stories are not only about water, but about the loss of knowledge, an intentional erasure, a reset button pressed by gods or fate to wipe away something humans weren't meant to keep. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's emotionally compelling. It turns disaster into a mystery with motive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can sit with the metaphor. Floods erase, floods also preserve. Floods bury objects in silt, and buried things sometimes survive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that periods of upheaval led to cultural disruption and loss of records, but a more cautious explanation could be that erasure is simply what happens when fragile systems collapse. Archives break, schools stop, trade routes fail, and knowledge fragments. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You look at the water again and notice how it reflects the sky, turning stars into trembling dots. It's like the heavens are trying to write on the river. You think about clay tablets, how they can survive by being baked, sometimes by accident. You think about flood silt, how it can bury a tablet and keep it safe from sun and wind. Archaeology suggests that preservation is often accidental, and the evidence we do have points to a strange partnership between destruction and survival. One interpretation is that the Sumerians may have understood this irony in a practical way. Store what matters in forms that can endure. A careful reading might suggest that the choice of clay as a medium, abundant, cheap, durable when fired, makes memory resilient. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's plausible. When you live in a floodplain, you learn to choose materials that can handle being wet, buried, and forgotten for a while. Historians still argue whether we should think of ancient archives as deliberately designed for preservation or as practical storage that happens to survive under certain conditions. There's no full consensus, and it might depend on the institution. The evidence we do have points to organized collections, but not necessarily to a modern concept of preserving for future archaeology, because nobody was thinking about archaeologists yet. That would be like you saving a grocery list specifically for aliens. It's adorable to imagine. Though, joke number 3. Softly, somewhere in time. An ancient scribe would be horrified to know their ration list became a museum treasure, while their poetry got lost. History has a sense of humor, and it's not always polite. You slow your steps. The riverbank feels cooler, and the wind feels damp on your lips. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, documented flood realities and flood stories. Interpreted links between lived experience and myth. Imagined moments of moonlight on water that make you wonder what memory the river keeps. And you return to the title question as gently as a blanket. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On solid ground. They knew that water can erase and reshape. So you build with humility. One interpretation is that they carried an awareness of impermanence into their institutions, writing, measurement, ritual, story. A more cautious explanation could be that all floodplain societies learn this, each in their own way. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You keep walking, listening to the river's slow voice, and you let the night hold you without demanding answers. You keep close to the river, but you let your path angle back toward the city's inner rooms, where stories live the way warmth lives, quietly stored in walls. Released slowly at night. The air still carries that damp clay scent, and when you inhale, it feels like the whole plain is made of memory that can be reshaped. Somewhere, a reed patch clicks together in the breeze, and it sounds almost like the soft tap of a stylus. Tap, press, lift, except now the marks are made in the dark of your attention. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature, preserved on clay tablets in cuneiform, includes some of the world's earliest surviving long-form narratives, and that the Epic of Gilgamesh is among the most famous. Archaeology suggests these stories circulated in written form over long periods, copied and recopied by scribes. And the evidence we do have points to tales that wrestle with power, friendship, loss, and the stubborn fact of mortality. What's broadly accepted is that this isn't just entertainment. It's a cultural mirror, reflecting what people feared, valued, and debated. You step into a courtyard where a few people sit close together, not because it's cold, but because that's how stories work, tight circles, shared breath, shared attention. A lamp in the middle flutters, and the light makes faces look softer, more ancient. Someone begins to speak, not loudly, just steady. You notice the way everyone else quiets down like a field settling after wind. One interpretation is that myth is a tool for holding human limits without collapsing under them. A careful reading might suggest that when a society tells a story about a king who can't outrun death, it's not only about him, it's about everyone listening. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it fits a simple human truth. If you can't control something, you try to name it, narrate it, wrap it in meaning. Historians still argue whether the Epic of Gilgamesh should be read primarily as a moral tale, a political reflection on kingship, a religious meditation, or a blend that shifts depending on the version and the audience. There's no full consensus, and that's part of what makes the story feel alive. Different listeners may hear different lessons. Different scribes may emphasize different details. The evidence we do have points to a tradition that changes even as it persists. You let the storyteller's voice become a slow current. The king is strong. The king is restless. The king learns. In stages. That strength doesn't solve everything. Most historians agree that the epic explores themes of hubris and the responsibilities of power. And archaeology suggests these themes resonated across centuries. The evidence we do have points to a society thinking carefully about leadership, what it means to be remembered, what it costs to be feared, what it risks to be alone. Joke number 1. Gentle, even in the ancient world, the powerful main character eventually discovers that being dramatic is not the same thing as being wise. Humanity really commits to recurring storylines. You glance at the storyteller's hands. They move in small gestures, like shaping clay in the air. You think about how these stories eventually become tablets, how someone presses wedge marks into mud to trap a voice for the future. A careful reading might suggest that writing doesn't only preserve stories, it changes them. Spoken tales can drift like smoke. Written tales can harden like fired clay. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's suggestive. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths also include accounts of creation, divine councils, city patron gods, and the precarious relationship between humans and divine forces. Archaeology suggests that temple culture and scribal culture overlap, and the evidence we do have points to stories that explain not just the world, but the rules of living in it. When you live in a floodplain under unpredictable skies, you may reach for narratives that make uncertainty feel held. One interpretation is that myth acts like a map for emotions that don't come with instructions. Grief, fear, jealousy, longing, pride. These are not solved by canals or ration lists. A careful reading might suggest that myth translates inner chaos into scenes. A journey, a trial, a dream, a warning. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a reasonable way to understand why stories endure, even when they aren't useful in the practical sense. Joke number 2. Softly. The ancient world invented the epic poem because therapy appointments were hard to schedule when your calendar depended on the moon. You keep listening. The story moves like a lantern carried through a dark corridor, showing one wall at a time, never the entire building. And you notice something soothing. The story doesn't demand perfection from humans. It doesn't pretend that kings are calm, or that friends don't fight, or that fear disappears if you ignore it. It simply shows the mess with enough shape that you can bear it. Now the misted "what if" arrives, clearly framed as possibility. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot about how to hold meaning without needing certainty? What if their stories weren't designed to answer every question, but to keep questions from becoming unbearable? This isn't a hidden truth, it's a puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. A fringe idea proposes that ancient myths are coded histories, literal records disguised as stories, preserving forgotten technologies, real cataclysms, or encounters with unusual beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because humans love the idea that a story is secretly a locked box with a key. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say myths sometimes echo real places, real floods, real political shifts, and real fears. But turning every symbol into a literal event is risky. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that some narrative elements are inspired by historical experiences. But a more cautious explanation could be that myth uses exaggeration and symbolism because that's what myth does. It stretches life into shapes that teach, comfort, or warn. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether specific episodes, like the flood within the Gilgamesh tradition, should be read as memory of particular events, as shared regional storytelling, or as moral theology expressed through narrative. There's no full consensus, and the safest approach is to hold the layers: documented text, interpreted meaning, imagined mood. You shift slightly, noticing your own body relaxing as the storyteller's cadence steadies. The lamp's flame wavers and then settles. Someone stifles a yawn. Someone else leans back against the wall, as if the wall has always been there to catch them. The city is quiet around you, but not empty. It's full of small sounds that don't ask anything from you. Most historians agree that scribes did more than copy numbers. They copied and shaped culture. Archaeology suggests many literary tablets come from educational or institutional settings, and the evidence we do have points to stories being part of training. Training not only in signs, but in values. A careful reading might suggest that when a student copies a story about a king learning humility, the lesson is not only in the words, it's in the repetition. You press the morale into clay the way you press a sign into a tablet. Joke number 3. Very soft. If you've ever learned something by rewriting it 3 times, you've basically joined an ancient scribal school, just with less mud on your hands and fewer stern teachers sighing behind you. You let your attention drift to the edges of the courtyard, where the night air carries that familiar river dampness. You remember the practical world, canals, rations, measures, and you see how myth sits alongside it, not replacing it, but filling in the spaces the ledger can't reach. The ledger can tell you how much barley. The story can tell you what it feels like to lose what matters. And again, you hold the title question gently. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, they knew how to store and transmit story across time, through speech, through tablets, through schooling. One interpretation is that they understood the value of narrative as social glue, a way to keep a city's heart beating in rhythm. A more cautious explanation could be that all societies do this in their own forms, and Sumer's survival in clay makes it unusually visible to us. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You keep walking as the storyteller's voice fades behind you, not abruptly, but like a lamp dimmed to a nightlight. The reeds whisper again, the river murmurs, and the soft tap of stylus on clay returns to your mind. Tap, press, lift, as if even a myth can become a kind of record. Pressed into the world's wet, waiting surface, you keep moving through the night as if the city itself is a slow river, channels of streets replacing channels of water. The smell shifts again. Less incense now, more smoke from cooking fires that have burned down to sleepy coals, plus that steady background note of damp earth. Your feet know the packed ground. Your mind knows the rhythm. Tap, press, lift, the quiet work of memory. Somewhere, a boat creaks at a mooring, and the sound feels like the city stretching in its sleep. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states were part of wider networks of exchange, because southern Mesopotamia had rich farmland but lacked many raw materials: stone, metals, quality timber. Archaeology suggests long-distance trade routes carried goods between Mesopotamia and regions that could provide what the alluvial plain could not. The evidence we do have points to movement: boats on rivers, caravans over land, traders negotiating in markets, and institutions, temples and palaces, tracking it all. You stand near a wharf where the canal widens, and you watch a boat glide in under moonlight. It's low in the water, heavy with cargo. Someone jumps down and ties a rope with quick confidence. There's a smell of fish, tar, wet wood, and a foreign dust. A crate is opened, and you catch a glimpse of stone that doesn't belong to this land, smooth, hard, stubbornly not mud. It feels almost exotic in a city built of clay. One interpretation is that trade isn't just about objects. It's about habits of mind. A careful reading might suggest that when you exchange goods with strangers, you also exchange expectations about weight, quality, fairness, language, and time. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a reasonable idea. Trade forces you to compare your world to someone else's world, and comparison changes you. Historians still argue whether early long-distance trade was mainly controlled by temples and palaces, or whether independent merchants had substantial autonomy, varying by period and city. There's no full consensus, and the debate matters because it changes the atmosphere. Is the dock a state-run artery, or a lively mixed space where private ambition and institutional power share the same muddy boots? You walk along the edge of the unloading area. You see bundles of reeds, sacks of grain, jars sealed with clay stoppers. You see bits of copper or bronze, small gleams that look like captured sunlight. You see timber beams that smell resinous, cut far from this flat land. And you realize how much effort it takes to build a city that looks inevitable from a textbook. Nothing is inevitable. Everything is carried. Joke number 1. Gently. Ancient globalization begins the same way modern globalization does. Someone says, "We don't have that here, so let's trade." And someone else says, "Great, but please don't spill your cargo in my canal." Most historians agree that Sumerian administrative systems could track goods across transactions, and archaeology suggests texts and sealings record deliveries, inventories, and obligations. The evidence we do have points to a world where commerce and bureaucracy are intertwined. Trade needs trust. Trust needs verification. Verification needs records. Records need scribes. Scribes need clay. Clay needs water. Water needs canals. The whole thing loops back to the river, as if the river is the original contract. One interpretation is that the forgotten thing might be how interdependent everything is. A careful reading might suggest that Sumerian cities were early experiments in systems thinking, even if nobody called it that. They learned, by necessity, that food, water, labor, measurement, ritual, and trade were braided strands. Pull one strand too hard, and the braid loosens. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it fits the way complex societies behave. Historians still argue whether we overestimate the coherence of these systems by looking at surviving records, which may reflect ideal administration more than everyday mess. There's no full consensus, because records often show what institutions wanted to be true, not always what actually happened on a chaotic market morning. The evidence we do have points to impressive organization, but also to human improvisation. You drift into the market itself, where traders sit on mats and stand behind low tables. The air smells like spices, sweat, wool, and the sharp tang of metal. Voices murmur in multiple accents. You can't always tell where a person is from, but you can tell when someone is confident in negotiation. That confidence has a universal flavor. A careful reading might suggest that markets are where cities learn flexibility. Temples and palaces love standardization. Markets love adaptation. You adjust to supply, demand, rumor, season. One interpretation is that this tension between fixed systems and flexible exchange keeps a society responsive, A more cautious explanation could be that it also creates friction, inequality, and dispute. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And you keep it calm and non-dramatic tonight, because bedtime history doesn't need alarms. Joke number 2. Softly. The oldest business strategy might be, tell them it's rare, and the oldest customer response might be, it was rare last week too. Now, gently, you let the mist enter for its 30%. A fringe idea proposes that certain trade goods were valued not only for practical use, but for hidden purposes. Ritual technology, arcane materials, or components for knowledge systems that were later lost. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it feeds on a real, documented fact. Exotic materials often carried symbolic weight. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say that rare items, lapis lazuli, fine metals, imported woods, could become status markers or ritual objects, which can look mysterious from a distance. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that some materials were reserved for elite or sacred contexts. But a more cautious explanation could be that scarcity and symbolism naturally elevate certain imports. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether our modern fascination with lost knowledge sometimes makes us misread ordinary trade as evidence of secret agendas. There's no full consensus, and it's worth staying gentle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You watch a seal being rolled onto a clay tag attached to a bundle. The image repeats cleanly, like a signature that can travel. The bundle is now not just a bundle. It's a bundle with identity. It has provenance. It has accountability. It has a story. Most historians agree that trade connected Mesopotamia to regions as far as Anatolia, the Iranian Plateau, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Though specifics depend on period and evidence type, archaeology suggests artifacts and texts that point to these connections, and the evidence we do have points to an ancient world more linked than people sometimes assume. One interpretation is that ideas traveled along these routes too. Methods, myths, measurements, and styles. A careful reading might suggest that what we later forgot could simply be the scale of early connectivity, and how quickly cultures can learn from one another when goods flow. A more cautious explanation could be that influence is hard to trace and often mutual. It's not always a one-way transfer. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Joke number 3. Very soft. You could say the first international shipping delays happened when a donkey decided a nap was non-negotiable. Some truths are timeless. You let the market sound fade as you walk back toward quieter lanes. The river's presence returns to the foreground, steady and indifferent. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented trade networks and material needs, interpreted effects on systems and ideas, imagined moonlit docks where foreign stone feels like a message from another world, and you keep walking, letting the city's ancient web of exchange hum softly in the background, like a lullaby made of ropes, jars, and far-off roads. You keep walking as the market noise dissolves behind you, and the city becomes a quilt of softer sounds, water poured into jars, sandals on packed earth, a distant cough, a baby settling back into sleep. The river is still near enough that the air tastes faintly mineral, like damp clay on your tongue. You pass a low doorway and catch a flicker of lamplight inside, warm and honey-colored, and you feel your pace slow without you asking it to. Most historians agree that health and healing in ancient Mesopotamia blended practical observation with ritual practice, and archaeology suggests that texts include both remedies and incantations. The evidence we do have points to a world where illness is not a single category. but a tangle. Sometimes a wound, sometimes a fever, sometimes a pain that comes and goes like a bad mood. And when the cause isn't clear, people reach for what they have: plants, minerals, poultices, massage, prayer, story, and the steady authority of a specialist. You turn into a quieter lane where the air smells different, less smoke, more herbs drying in bundles. A doorway stands open just a little, as if the house is breathing. Inside, someone lies on a mat with a folded cloth beneath their head. A lamp burns low. The scene is intimate, not dramatic, because most of life, and most of illness, happens in rooms that don't make it into heroic epics. A healer sits close by. They don't look like a magician in a robe. They look like a person with practiced hands and a tired calm, the kind of calm you get when you've seen many bodies do strange things. They hold a small bowl. They crush something with a stone, slow and rhythmic. You smell bitterness, maybe from a plant resin, and the smell makes your nose want to wrinkle. But you behave politely because you're a guest in someone's 1,000-year-old night. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian healing traditions involved different roles. Practitioners who might be described, in modern terms, as herbalists or physicians, and others whose work leaned more toward ritual specialists. Archaeology suggests tablets that record symptoms, rituals and treatments, and the evidence we do have points to a culture that tried to classify illness in its own way. Some descriptions are surprisingly detailed, even if the underlying explanations don't match modern medicine. One interpretation is that the blend of remedy and incantation isn't either-or. A careful reading might suggest it's and, when you don't know whether the fever is from bad water, bad luck, or something you can't see. You treat the body and soothe the mind. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's a gentle, human logic. People don't only want to be healed. They want to feel held while healing happens. Historians still argue whether the most effective part of certain ancient treatments was the pharmacological action of ingredients, the calming structure of ritual, or the social trust created by the healer's presence. There's no full consensus, partly because evidence is uneven, and partly because human experience is rarely tidy enough to isolate one factor. The evidence we do have points to real attempts at care, attempts that sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, and often mixed approaches without apology. The healer dips fingers into the bowl and tests the paste on the inside of their wrist, like they're checking texture and temperature. Then they apply it carefully to the sick person's skin. The touch is steady, and the steadiness itself seems to matter. You notice how the patient's breathing slows a little. Not a miracle, just a small shift. The kind of shift that makes a night feel survivable. Joke number 1. Very soft. The first clinical trial might have been someone saying, "We tried this paste last month and Uncle stopped complaining. So, it's worth another round." Most historians agree that Mesopotamians also used amulets, protective symbols, and spoken formulas. And archaeology suggests that some texts aim to ward off harmful forces believed to cause illness. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where misfortune can have agency, where sickness might be linked, in some explanations, to spirits, curses, or divine displeasure. You keep your language careful here. That's not a modern scientific frame, but it is a coherent cultural frame. And coherence is its own kind of comfort. One interpretation is that incantations function like guided breathing for a frightened mind. A careful reading might suggest that rhythm, repetition, and the certainty of a spoken pattern can soothe a household in crisis. That's interpretation, not certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that incantations reinforced social order and moral behavior by tying wellness to proper conduct. That's a possibility, not a certainty. and the truth may vary from case to case. You notice something else. The presence of writing even here. A small tablet sits near the healer's knee. The marks are neat. Maybe it's a recipe. Maybe it's a list of symptoms. Maybe it's a ritual text. Or maybe it's simply a record for an institution, because institutions love records. Even when the subject is human suffering, the reed stylus sound returns in your imagination. That soft tap into clay, as if even a fever can be pressed into a form the city can remember. Most historians agree that scribal culture preserved technical knowledge alongside administrative and literary texts. And archaeology suggests that some tablets record practices across many fields: law, math, ritual, and medicine. The evidence we do have points to something quietly impressive. People were building libraries of experience, even when they framed that experience differently than we do now. Joke number 2. If you've ever Googled your symptoms at 1 a.m. and decided you're definitely turning into a haunted lamp, you're not alone. Ancient people also lived with uncertainty. They just used clay instead of search bars. Now, gently, you allow the 30% mist to drift in, clearly labeled. A popular rumor claims that some Mesopotamian healing texts hide advanced medical knowledge, lost formulas, secret anatomical insights, or cures that modern medicine somehow overlooked. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's tempting because it flatters our hopes that there's a perfect answer waiting in an old drawer. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say ancient remedies sometimes had real active ingredients, and some could have been effective in certain cases. But the evidence is not strong enough to turn that into a sweeping claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that a few treatments were surprisingly useful, but a more cautious explanation could be that success varied, and many remedies worked mostly by comfort, routine, and the body's natural recovery. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You watch the healer speak quietly, not loudly enough for the whole street, just enough for the room. The words have a rhythm. The household listens. Even if you don't believe the words reshape reality, you can feel that they reshape the room. The room becomes less panicked, more orderly. And order in a crisis is its own medicine. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian thought often linked well-being to balance, within the body, within the household, within the relationship to the divine. Archaeology suggests a mix of practical and symbolic strategies for restoring that balance. The evidence we do have points to a culture that didn't separate mind, body, and world into neat compartments. One interpretation is that their approach acknowledges something modern life sometimes forgets. Being cared for is part of getting better. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a gentle possibility that sits comfortably in a bedtime story. Joke number 3. Barely there. The ancient healer's bedside manner is basically, we will do the paste, we will do the words, we will do the waiting, which is also how you handle a bad cold today, just with fewer wedges and more tissues. You step back toward the doorway as if to give the room privacy. The lamp flame trembles and then steadies again. You hear the canal outside, that soft water sound that never quite stops. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, documented evidence of remedies and incantations, interpreted reasons for why a blended approach might help, imagined lamplight in a small room where healing is slow and human. And as you return to the lane, the title question follows you like a quiet shadow. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot, on documented ground? They knew how to record care, how to build routines around uncertainty. One interpretation is that they understood the value of treating the whole moment, not just the symptom, body, mind, community, meaning. A more cautious explanation could be that this is a universal human response to illness. And Sumer's gift to us is simply that it wrote it down in clay. You keep walking, letting the river air cool your face, letting the reed stylus rhythm fade into a lullaby again. You continue without breaking stride, and the night feels even softer now, like the city has wrapped itself in a quieter blanket. The river is still close enough to scent the air, but you also smell baked mud brick and faint ash from extinguished fires. Your steps make little puffs of dust. The reed stylus rhythm has become an inner metronome. Tap, press, lift. Steady enough that your thoughts begin to line up behind it. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian societies developed formal approaches to law and dispute resolution. And archaeology suggests written legal texts and court records appear in later periods with roots in earlier administrative practice. The evidence we do have points to something clear. Once cities get large, disagreements get loud. People argue about land boundaries, payments, marriages, injuries, debts, and promises. And when too many arguments turn into chaos, a society tries to build rails. You walk into a public space, an open area near a gate or a temple courtyard, where people gather for business that is both ordinary and deeply important. A few stand in a loose cluster. A scribe sits off to the side with a tablet, calm as a stone. An official listens with the heavy patience of someone who has heard every version of "it wasn't my fault." You notice how the air feels different here. Less intimate than the healer's room. More exposed, more careful. Words matter. What's broadly accepted is that written law codes, like the later code of Ur-Nama and other collections, aim to standardize justice and set expectations, even if they reflect ideals more than everyday reality. Archaeology suggests legal language that defines penalties, compensations, and obligations. The evidence we do have points to a desire for consistency. If you know the rule, you know what to expect. And expectation is a kind of peace. One interpretation is that law is an extension of writing's original purpose, stabilizing memory. A careful reading might suggest that the legal system turns "we said" into "it is written." That's interpretation, not certainty, but it fits what we've been carrying all night, the urge to make the fragile durable. A promise spoken can vanish into the air. A promise pressed into clay can wait on a shelf until someone needs it. Historians still argue whether early law codes were primarily tools of fairness, tools of state control, or tools of social hierarchy. There's no full consensus, because a law can serve multiple purposes at once. It can protect, it can punish, it can normalize inequality. The evidence we do have points to structured compensation in some cases, and to social distinctions in others. Tonight, you don't force one single moral reading. You let it be a complex human artifact. You listen as a dispute unfolds. Two people point at a boundary marker, maybe a stone, maybe a line, maybe a canal edge. One says the land is theirs. The other says no. It's been theirs for years. A witness is called. The witness looks uncomfortable, because witnesses always look uncomfortable, even in ancient times. A scribe scratches marks into clay with that calm rhythm. Tap, press, lift, joke number 1. Gently. The oldest legal argument might be, "That's my field." And the oldest witness response might be, "I'd really prefer not to be involved." Most historians agree that documents like contracts, receipts, and loan records were common in Mesopotamian contexts. And archaeology suggests people used seals and witnesses to validate agreements. The evidence we do have points to a world where paperless bureaucracy is still bureaucracy. People had systems for proof, they had procedures, they had the early shape of what you might call due process, though the details and fairness could vary widely. One interpretation is that law is society's attempt to make the unpredictable predictable. A careful reading might suggest that the greatest comfort of a rule is not that it's perfect, but that it's known. If you know the penalty, you can decide your next move. That's interpretation, not certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that rulers and institutions promoted legal norms to reduce conflict that threatened stability and taxation. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and both motives can coexist. Historians still argue whether written codes were actively used as everyday references, or whether they functioned more as ideological statements, showing what a ruler wanted to project about order and justice. There's no full consensus, and the truth may differ by time and city. The evidence we do have points to legal practice existing beyond the codes, in records of cases and transactions, suggesting law lived both in texts and in habits. You notice something subtle, the way the crowd listens. They may not all be literate, but they know the ritual of procedure. They know when to speak, when to wait, when to gesture. A careful reading might suggest that law creates a shared choreography. You don't just settle disputes, you perform settlement. And the performance teaches the community what order looks like. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a gentle and plausible idea. Joke number 2. Softly, you can almost hear an ancient person sighing. We're doing this whole process again. Fine, I brought snacks. Now the 30% mist arrives, clearly framed. A fringe idea proposes that early legal and administrative texts include hidden instructions, coded messages about governance, secret agreements between elites, or rules meant to manipulate populations while pretending to be fair. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows naturally from a simple truth. Systems can be used well or poorly, and people sometimes mistrust what they can't read. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say legal language can be opaque, and opacity can create power imbalances without requiring a grand secret plot. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that elites benefited from legal complexity, but a more cautious explanation could be that complexity arises as a practical response to many kinds of disputes. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You watch the officials speak, and you notice the tone. Measured, not theatrical. The decision, whatever it is, lands with a kind of weight. Someone looks relieved, someone looks resigned, and then life continues. Because that's what systems do. They absorb conflict and let people return to work. Most historians agree that early cities needed social mechanisms to prevent constant feuding and fragmentation. Archaeology suggests that law, along with kinship and temple authority, served as one of those mechanisms. The evidence we do have points to a civilization trying to make cooperation possible at scale. You can't build canals and temples if everyone is busy fighting over every jar. One interpretation is that the forgotten thing might be how much of civilization is built on agreed procedures. A careful reading might suggest that Sumerian society didn't just invent writing. It invented a habit of arbitration, of letting a shared system decide when personal feelings couldn't. That's interpretation, not certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that arbitration existed in many forms before writing, and writing simply made it more visible and more enforceable. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the legal ideals expressed in codes reflect genuine reforms or symbolic self-presentation by rulers. There's no full consensus. And you keep your tone gentle. Rulers often want to look just, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. And sometimes it's a complicated mix. The evidence we do have points to a world where justice is both practiced and performed. Joke number 3. Barely a whisper. The first person to complain that the system is slow probably lived here too. And yes, the system was slow, because the system was made of clay. You step away from the public space and back into quieter lanes, where the night feels less argumentative and more sleepy. The river air cools your face. The canal water murmurs. The reed stylus rhythm returns as a comfort rather than a task. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented existence of contracts, legal texts, and dispute procedures. Interpreted ideas about stability and shared choreography. Imagined moments of people waiting in line for justice under lamplight. And you hold the title question softly again. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, they knew how to turn conflict into procedure. One interpretation is that they understood the calming power of rules. Not because rules are perfect, but because rules are shared. A more cautious explanation could be that every complex society learns this. And Sumer's unique gift is that its rules and arguments left wedge-shaped footprints we can still follow. You keep walking, letting those footprints fade into the night without needing to solve them. You keep walking, and the city feels like it's thinning into quieter layers. Fewer voices, more night air, more soft water sound. The river doesn't vanish. It just becomes a background presence, like a steady hand on the world's shoulder. The smell of damp clay returns again. Familiar now, almost comforting, as if the land itself is reminding you what it's made of. Most historians agree that Sumerian society developed sophisticated practical techniques for its time, especially in irrigation, construction, administration, and craft production. Archaeology suggests organized labor and specialized workshops. And the evidence we do have points to people who could build canals that held water in a stubborn landscape, shape mud brick into stable walls, and coordinate food distribution for large groups without everything collapsing into chaos. What's broadly accepted is that none of this required magic. It required consistency, skill, and a stubborn refusal to let the river win every argument. You pass a workshop where the air smells of hot clay and smoke. A potter's wheel turns slowly, and the motion is hypnotic in the same way the reed stylus has been hypnotic. Repetition making order. A bowl rises from wet clay under steady hands. Nearby, a brickmaker stacks fresh bricks in neat rows, careful about spacing so the air can do its work. You realize that technology here looks like patience and practice, not glowing lights and dramatic sound effects. One interpretation is that the real ancient, advanced knowledge is often ordinary knowledge done extremely well, done for generations until it becomes invisible. A careful reading might suggest that when you see a city, you're seeing countless small skills layered together. How to mix straw into mud, how to angle a wall, how to align a canal gate, how to store grain so it lasts. That's interpretation. Not certainty, but it's a reasonable way to respect the past without turning it into fantasy. Historians still argue whether certain Sumerian techniques were shared widely across households or held mainly by specialized guild-like groups tied to institutions. There's no full consensus. Because the evidence is uneven and because skills move in quiet ways through apprenticeship, family teaching, imitation, and the simple human habit of watching what works and copying it. You pause beside a canal edge and watch water slide by. Slow and purposeful, You imagine a worker checking the bank for leaks, patching weak spots with fresh clay. Archaeology suggests that irrigation required constant upkeep, and the evidence we do have points to a reality that sounds almost boring until you let it sink in. Maintenance is civilization's heartbeat. Skip maintenance long enough, and everything becomes a story about what used to be here. Joke number 1. Gently. The ancient world's most powerful invention might be the schedule, because the canal does not care about your feelings, and it also doesn't care that you meant to fix it later. As you move deeper into the workshop area, you notice metalwork in small flashes. Tools, ornaments, blades, hooks, not a display of power, more a display of usefulness. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies used metals like copper and bronze, and later iron in broader regional history. And archaeology suggests complex trade networks supported access to these materials. The evidence we do have points to craft specialization, people who know how to heat, shape, and combine materials so they behave. One interpretation is that these techniques can feel lost to us, not because they were supernatural, but because the everyday chain of knowledge is fragile. A careful reading might suggest that if a workshop closes, if apprentices stop training, if trade routes break, a technique can vanish within a generation or two. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a plausible explanation for why certain skills seem to appear and disappear across long history. You stop near a shelf where objects rest in quiet rows, a seal stone, a small tool, a broken ceramic piece with a glaze-like sheen. You imagine the tactile familiarity of each object in its own time. And this is where your title question sharpens into a particular shape. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? Not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient to carry through disruption. Now you let the mist drift in, clearly labeled, never dressed up as fact. A popular rumor claims that the Sumerians possessed lost technology beyond what archaeology acknowledges. Mysterious energy devices, impossible machines, or knowledge gifted by outsiders. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's popular because it gives a dramatic answer to a quiet problem. How could people so long ago build complex systems? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask a gentler version of the question, what knowledge is easy to lose when systems break? Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that some techniques were more advanced than we currently understand. But a more cautious explanation could be that the advanced part is organization, not gadgets, coordination of labor, standardization of measures, record keeping, and accumulated craft skill. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You step into a quieter corner where broken things are piled. Shards, cracked seals, fragments of tools. It looks like trash, until you remember that trash is often the most honest archive. Archaeology suggests that much of what we learn comes from discarded or buried material, and the evidence we do have points to daily life preserved by accident more than by intention. One interpretation is that the past is full of missing links, not because they never existed, but because they didn't survive. Wood rots, textiles decay, recipes live in hands and disappear when hands stop teaching. A careful reading might suggest that what we call forgotten might simply be the parts of life that don't fossilize well. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it's a grounding way to keep wonder without slipping into certainty. Joke number 2. Softly, history is like finding one spoon and trying to reconstruct the entire kitchen. You can do your best, but you might still be wrong about whether they preferred soup. You linger by a workbench where a reed stylus lies next to a lump of clay, because scribes and craftspeople often share the same universe. The stylus looks ordinary, just a cut reed, but it carries an entire city's memory. Most historians agree that writing and administration supported complex economies, and archaeology suggests that craft production and distribution were often recorded in tablets. The evidence we do have points to a feedback loop. You can build bigger systems when you can record them, and you can record more when your systems grow. One interpretation is that the forgotten knowledge might be a pattern of thinking, seeing the city as an interlocking machine made of people, water, time, and trust. A careful reading might suggest that Sumerian life required a daily awareness of dependencies. If the canal fails, the grain fails. If the grain fails, the rations fail. If the rations fail, the labor fails. If the labor fails, the walls fail. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's an elegant and calm possibility. Now the mist gets a second small thread, still kept soft and labeled. A fringe idea proposes that certain Sumerian artifacts, odd shapes, unusual stones, or puzzling inscriptions are remnants of devices whose purpose we no longer recognize. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it reminds you of a real, mainstream truth. Without context, objects can become mysterious. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say, sometimes we genuinely don't know what an item was for. And sometimes the answer is beautifully simple. Like, it's a weight, or it's a game piece, or it's the ancient equivalent of a keychain. Joke number 3. Gently. Imagine an archaeologist in the far future finding a TV remote and announcing, with great confidence, that it was a sacred ritual wand. Honestly, they wouldn't be completely wrong about how people treat it. Most historians agree that many aspects of Sumerian daily life remain partially hidden because preservation is uneven and excavation is incomplete. Archaeology suggests we have a patchwork, spectacular in places, silent in others, and the evidence we do have points to a world both familiar and strange. That's why your tone stays careful. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So you stand in the quiet workshop lane and let the question settle again. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On solid ground, they knew how to make a fragile landscape livable through maintenance, measurement, writing, and craft. One interpretation is that their secret was continuity, the willingness to repeat essential tasks, teach skills, and respect systems that don't sparkle. A more cautious explanation could be that every civilization learns this, and what we forget is simply how much work it takes to keep the lights on, especially when the lights are oil lamps and the walls are mud brick. You start walking again, and the river air cools your face. The stylus rhythm returns as a lullaby, tap, press, lift, while the city's half-seen skills hum quietly behind you, waiting for the next pair of hands to remember them. You keep moving, and the city's edges begin to feel less like walls and more like thresholds. The night air opens up. The smells thin, less smoke, more open plain, more river dampness carried on a wider breeze. You can still hear water in canals, but now it's mixed with the far-off hush of reeds and the occasional rustle of something small in the grass. The reed stylus rhythm remains in your mind. Tap, press, lift. But it starts to feel like a heartbeat passing from one body to another. Most historians agree that political power in Mesopotamia shifts over time, and that Sumerian city-states do not remain the sole centers of authority indefinitely. Archaeology suggests periods of consolidation, conquest, and cultural blending, with Akkadian and later traditions rising in prominence. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change braided together. Languages shift, rulers change, administrative styles adapt, but many practices, writing, measurement, temple economy, continue in modified forms. You walk along a canal road that leads away from the densest streets. In the distance, you imagine banners and new accents in the marketplace, new officials in courtyards, new royal names pressed into clay. None of it feels like a sudden apocalypse. It feels like a handover, sometimes rough, sometimes negotiated, sometimes simply inevitable. The way a season changes while you're busy doing chores. One interpretation is that cultural inheritance is rarely a clean transfer. A careful reading might suggest that when one power rises over another, it doesn't pick up the old culture like a complete toolkit. It selects, it adapts, it forgets some things, keeps others, reshapes others to fit new needs. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's consistent with how human institutions behave. Historians still argue whether certain transitions, like the rise of Akkadian power, should be framed primarily as conquest, as integration, or as a complex mix of both. There's no full consensus, and the evidence we do have points to multiple realities depending on region and moment. Some cities may have experienced violent disruption. Others may have experienced administrative takeover. Some may have simply adjusted to new political branding while daily life stayed stubbornly familiar. You pass an archive room in your imagination, and you see older tablets stacked beside newer ones. The older ones are written in one language, the newer ones in another. But the script, those wedge marks, remains recognizable. Most historians agree that cuneiform persists as a writing system across many languages for a very long time. Archaeology suggests scribes acted as bridges, learning old forms, adapting to new ones, and preserving traditions even as spoken speech changed. The evidence we do have points to scribes as the quiet continuity that makes history feel connected. Joke number 1. Gently. If you've ever had to update the spreadsheet format for a new boss, you understand the ancient scribe's pain on a spiritual level. One interpretation is that what gets forgotten is often what no longer has institutional support. A careful reading might suggest that knowledge survives when it has a job, when it pays rent, when it's needed for administration, ritual, or trade. When institutions shift, the job description of knowledge shifts too. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a calm way to understand loss without needing dramatic conspiracy. Historians still argue whether we should think of cultural collapse as a sudden break or as a series of overlapping adjustments that look like collapse only from far away. There's no full consensus because the archaeological record can show sharp changes in some places and continuity in others. The evidence we do have points to a patchwork, some disruptions, some steady threads. You walk toward a place where the city meets the plain. The sky is bigger here. The stars feel closer, and the river's presence feels older than any dynasty. You think about how much of Sumer's legacy continues. The writing systems spread, the persistence of temple structures, the endurance of base 60 in later mathematical traditions, the echo of flood stories in later texts. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian cultures inherit and reshape elements of Sumerian tradition. One interpretation is that inheritance can be uneven in a way that feels like forgetting. A careful reading might suggest that even when a culture receives a tool, it may not receive the original mindset that made the tool meaningful. The stylus can remain while the old stories change. The temple can remain while the old festivals shift. The calendar can remain while the old reasons for counting the sky fade. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's an elegant possibility for why something can be there and still feel lost. Joke number 2. Softly. It's like inheriting your grandparents' recipe book but skipping the little handwritten notes in the margins. The notes that say, "Add more salt when you're sad," which is, frankly, priceless cultural data. Now the 30% mist enters, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that later cultures deliberately filtered Sumerian knowledge, hiding some of it, suppressing parts of it, or selectively preserving only what served new powers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it isn't completely absurd as a general human behavior. Institutions do curate, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. We can say it's possible that political shifts influenced what was copied, what was taught, and what was archived. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that some traditions faded because they weren't favored. But a more cautious explanation could be that fading happens naturally when languages change, resources shift, and educational priorities evolve. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Historians still argue whether the survival of certain texts and practices reflects deliberate preservation choices or simply accidents of archaeology. What burned? What got buried? What got copied? Often. There's no full consensus, and it's worth remembering that what you read today is partly what survived. Not necessarily what mattered most. You imagine a scribe in a later century copying a Sumerian hymn they barely speak, because tradition says it's important. Their hand knows the signs, but their mind feels the distance. The reed stylus presses into clay anyway. Tap, press, lift. The sound is the same, but the inner meaning might be shifting. One interpretation is that this is how forgetting happens, not by sudden amnesia, but by slow translation, slow repurposing, slow drift. That's interpretation, not certainty. Joke number 3. Quiet. Sometimes lost knowledge isn't lost. It's just stuck behind a language barrier, like a modern person staring at an instruction manual and deciding, "I'll just figure it out," which is how disasters are born. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian history is full of layered cultures: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and others, each inheriting, reshaping, and adding. Archaeology suggests both continuity and innovation in these transitions. The evidence we do have points to a long conversation across centuries, not a single monologue. So you hold your title question again, softly. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? On documented ground, much of what they developed continued in altered forms. One interpretation is that what we forgot might be the original context, the lived, river-soaked reasons behind certain practices. A more cautious explanation could be that we haven't forgotten so much as we've inherited fragments, and fragments always leave you curious about the missing whole. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You keep walking into the open plain. The city behind you feels quieter, like a sleeping animal. The river ahead feels steady, like time itself, and the stylus rhythm stays with you, not as a task now, but as a lullaby of continuity. Tap, press, lift, passed from one culture's hand to another. You keep walking, and the night begins to feel like it's loosening its grip. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just in the subtle way the air changes when dawn is still far off, but already thinking about arriving. The river smells cooler now, almost metallic, and the reeds whisper in a thinner breeze. Behind you, the city's sounds are quieter than before, as if even the clay walls are trying to rest. Ahead of you, The plain stretches flat and open, a place where the sky can feel like a roof and the earth can feel like a page. Most historians agree that Sumer's legacy echoes far beyond the cities that first shaped it, through writing traditions, administrative habits, mathematics, and mythic themes that later cultures inherited and adapted. Archaeology suggests that the material record is both rich and incomplete, and the evidence we do have points to a civilization that helped define what civilization could look like in a river landscape. That's the solid ground, and you've been walking on it all night. Now you hold the title, question one last time, the way you might hold a warm mug with both hands. What if the Sumerians knew something we later forgot? One interpretation is that what we forgot isn't a secret device or a hidden map, but a relationship, an ancient relationship to attention. A careful reading might suggest that Sumerian life trained people to notice dependencies: water to grain, grain to labor, labor to records, records to trust, trust to social stability. That's interpretation, not certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that all complex societies develop this awareness in their own ways. And Sumer stands out because its methods survived in clay. Historians still argue whether we should think of Sumer as a singular starting point or as one remarkable cluster among several early centers of complexity. There's no full consensus, and it's healthy to keep the framing modest. The evidence we do have points to extraordinary innovation in southern Mesopotamia, but also to a world where many regions were experimenting with cities, farming systems, and social organization. Tonight, you don't need a single origin myth. You only need the quiet truth that humans have been building and forgetting and rebuilding for a very long time. You remember the reed stylus: tap, press, lift, and you realize how gentle that act is. It's not a sword, it's not a thunderbolt. It's a small tool shaping wet clay with patience. Most historians agree that early writing emerges in practical contexts, and archaeology suggests it becomes a long-lived medium for everything from rations to hymns. The evidence we do have points to a lesson so ordinary it can feel profound. If you want something to last, you give it a form. Joke number one. Softly. The Sumerians invented save, and their save icon was basically a mud tablet, very on brand for a river civilization. Now, carefully, you allow the final thread of mist, kept at 30% and labeled as such. A fringe idea proposes that somewhere in the lost archives of early cities, there was a specific piece of knowledge that later ages never recovered. An insight about the sky, a mathematical trick, a technique for water management, or a philosophy of governance. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single dramatic missing secret is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still let the question do its gentle work. It invites humility. It reminds you that your picture of the past is partial, and that partial pictures naturally leave blank spaces. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that certain specialized practices are underrepresented in what survived, but a more cautious explanation could be that what's missing is mostly context, oral teaching, perishable materials, everyday expertise that didn't get written down or didn't endure. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You look back across the path you've walked in your mind. Tablets stacked like bricks, scribal students copying signs, temples storing grain and meaning, numbers dividing time, watchers reading the sky, floods layering the earth, myths holding human limits, trade routes carrying stone and stories, healers blending paste and prayer, laws turning disputes into procedure, workshops shaping clay into usefulness, and handoffs of power that filter what survives. None of it needs to become a single hidden truth. It can remain a braided rope of documented facts, careful interpretations, and gentle imagination. Historians still argue whether what we call forgetting is truly loss or simply transformation. Knowledge changing shape as it travels. There's no full consensus, and that's comforting tonight because it means your curiosity can rest. You don't have to solve it. You can simply notice it. Joke number 2. Quietly. If knowledge is a torch, history is that friend who keeps passing it along but occasionally drops it. Then says, "It's fine, it still lights," while sparks are definitely flying. And maybe that's the calm answer hiding in plain sight. What if the Sumerians knew that nothing stays stable unless you maintain it? Canals, stories, systems, even attention itself? The evidence we do have points to a world of constant upkeep, and that might support the idea that their deepest wisdom was practical. Repeat what matters. Teach what matters. Record what matters. And accept that the river will still have opinions. Now the pacing slows, as promised, and you let the story soften into its wind down, letting the sentences lengthen and the edges blur into gentleness. You imagine yourself back at the riverbank, the same one from the beginning, where moonlight turns the water dark and glossy, and the reeds lean toward the current as if listening, and the air tastes faintly of clay and cool stone, and your steps are quiet because the past is still asleep and you don't want to wake it. Some parts of tonight have been solid ground, what's broadly accepted, what archaeology suggests, what most historians agree on, and some parts have been interpretation, and some parts have been calm what-if imagination, and you've kept them separated the way you keep dry matches away from water, not because you fear water, but because you respect what each thing is meant to do. You let your shoulders loosen, and you let your jaw unclench, and you notice your breathing, slow and even, matching the river's pace. And you imagine the reed stylus again, not as a tool for work, but as a tiny wand of patience, pressing the smallest marks into clay. Tap, press, lift, as if the world itself can be soothed by repetition. You don't need a final answer tonight. You don't need a hidden door to open. You only need the feeling of walking through a place where people once tried, earnestly, to keep life steady, by counting, by writing, by building, by telling stories, by making rules, by sharing bread, by watching the sky, by tending to the sick, by repairing the canal bank one more time, even when they were tired. And as you stand there in your imagination, the river keeps moving, and the stars keep shining, and the city behind you rests in the dark, and you feel the oldest lesson settle over you like a blanket. Whatever we forget, we can still practice remembering gently. Joke number 3. A whisper with a smile. And if you forget that lesson by morning, don't worry. Humans have been doing that for thousands of years. You're an excellent, deeply ancient company. So you let the reeds sway. You let the water murmur. You let the night air cool your face. You let the last bit of curiosity drift into sleep without needing to pin it down into a final wedge mark. Because tonight's journey was never about proving, only about noticing. And very softly, as if you're speaking to yourself, you breathe out the last image, a clay tablet drying under starlight, the marks still fresh. The message not loud, not urgent, just patient, waiting for someone, someday to look and wonder, and then to rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.